For 45 years, the evidence from Esther Gonzalez's murder seemed worthless. A few traces of DNA that were too degraded for 1979 technology. A crime scene that had been compromised by weather and time. But in 2024, the Riverside County cold case team applied revolutionary forensic genealogy to evidence that had been sitting in storage since the Carter administration. What they discovered would shock even veteran investigators. Esther's killer had been identified, but he had died in 2014 without ever being suspected. Before we dive into this 45-year breakthrough, if cold cases like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's most challenging mysteries. February 8, 1979. 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez should have been thinking about senior year, college applications, and weekend plans with friends. Instead, she was walking alone along Highway 243 in Riverside County, California, when someone stopped their car and offered her a ride. Detective Ray Segala of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department was one of the first investigators to arrive at the crime scene. Even with decades of experience in violent crimes, what he found that day haunted him for the rest of his career. Esther's body had been brutally attacked and left beside the road like discarded trash. This wasn't a robbery, Segala observed as he processed the scene. Her purse was intact, no money taken. This was pure violence, the kind that comes from someone who enjoys causing pain. The physical evidence was frustratingly minimal. A few trace samples of DNA were collected, but in 1979, genetic analysis was primitive at best. The crime scene had been exposed to weather and traffic contamination. Witnesses were scarce on the isolated stretch of highway. Esther's family was devastated. Her older sister Elizabeth became the family's voice, calling detectives regularly and organizing search efforts when the case inevitably went cold. Elizabeth refused to let Esther become just another forgotten victim in the California justice system. Esther was going to be something special, Elizabeth told Detective Segala during one of their many conversations. She had dreams, plans for the future. Someone took all of that away from her, and they need to pay for it. But as months turned to years, the Esther Gonzalez case file grew thicker with dead-end reports and failed leads. The DNA samples collected in 1979 were too degraded for the limited technology of the era. Suspects were investigated and eliminated. The case joined thousands of other unsolved murders in California's growing cold case backlog. Detective Mike Pelz inherited Esther's case in the 1990s when he joined Riverside County's newly formed cold case unit. He found himself drawn to Esther's story, a bright teenager whose life had been cut short by seemingly random violence. Pelz spent countless hours reviewing the case files, re-interviewing witnesses, and pursuing new leads that inevitably led nowhere. The original DNA samples had been carefully preserved, but they remained too degraded for conventional analysis. Every few years, I would pull Esther's file and see if new technology might help us, Pelz reflected years later. But the samples were so old, so compromised by time and storage conditions, that they seemed useless. The Gonzalez family never gave up hope. Elizabeth married, had children, and built a life, but she never stopped calling the sheriff's department about Esther's case. Each Christmas, each birthday, each anniversary of the murder, Elizabeth would contact investigators asking about new leads, new techniques, anything that might finally bring justice for her sister. In 2014, something significant happened that nobody realized at the time. Lewis Randy Williamson, a 57-year-old California resident, died of complications related to his chronic health problems. Williamson had lived a relatively quiet life, working various jobs and maintaining relationships throughout Southern California. His death was unremarkable, noted only by family and friends who mourned his passing. But Lewis Williamson had been carrying a secret for 35 years. A secret that would take another decade to uncover. By 2023, the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team had access to forensic technologies that seemed like science fiction in 1979. Genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigations, allowing investigators to identify suspects from DNA samples that were previously considered unusable. Detective Sergeant Devin Delinsky took charge of Esther's case as part of a systematic review of the county's oldest unsolved murders. He immediately recognized the potential in the preserved evidence from 1979. The DNA samples from Esther's case were degraded, but they weren't destroyed, Delinsky explained to his team. New extraction techniques might allow us to get a genetic profile that we could use for genealogical analysis. The evidence was sent to a specialized laboratory that focused on extracting DNA from challenging samples. Using cutting-edge techniques that hadn't existed even 5 years earlier, technicians were able to isolate enough genetic material to create a profile suitable for genealogy databases. The breakthrough came in November 2024, when genetic genealogists working with the cold case team identified a family lineage that matched the DNA profile. The trail led them to Lewis Randy Williamson, who had died 10 years earlier without ever being suspected of Esther's murder. Delinsky felt a mixture of excitement and frustration as he reviewed Williamson's background. Here was their suspect, conclusively identified through science, but justice would be forever denied because death had claimed him first. Lewis Randy Williamson's life began to take on new meaning as investigators dug deeper into his background. What they discovered suggested that Esther Gonzalez may not have been his only victim. Williamson had lived throughout Southern California during the 1970s and 1980s, moving frequently and working a variety of jobs that brought him into contact with vulnerable young women. He had been arrested several times for minor offenses, but had never been seriously investigated for violent crimes. If this investigation is keeping you on the edge of your seat, please take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Cold cases like Esther's depend on public attention to ensure justice is never forgotten. Detective Delinsky began cross-referencing Williamson's known locations with unsolved murders and disappearances from the same time periods. The patterns he discovered were disturbing. Multiple cases of young women who had been killed or had vanished from areas where Williamson had lived or worked. We may be looking at a serial killer who operated for decades without detection, Delinsky told his supervisors. Esther Gonzalez might have been one of his first victims, but she definitely wasn't his last. The investigation expanded beyond Riverside County as detectives from multiple jurisdictions began comparing notes about unsolved cases that might be connected to Lewis Williamson. His death in 2014 had effectively ended what may have been one of California's longest-running killing sprees. On November 21, 2024, the Riverside County Sheriff's Department held a press conference to announce that Esther Gonzalez's murder had been solved through genetic genealogy. Elizabeth Gonzalez, now in her 60s, attended the announcement with mixed emotions. "We are very happy that we finally have closure," Elizabeth wrote in a statement released through the Sheriff's Department. "We are happy about it, but since the guy has died, a little sad that he won't spend any time for her murder." Detective Delinsky understood the family's conflicted feelings. After 45 years of waiting for justice, learning that the killer had died peacefully in 2014 felt like a hollow victory. But at least the Gonzalez family finally had answers about who had destroyed their loved one's future. The identification of Lewis Williamson also opened new questions about other unsolved cases throughout California. Investigators began the painstaking process of comparing DNA evidence from dozens of cold cases to determine if Williamson might have been responsible for other murders. This case demonstrates why we never give up on victims, no matter how much time has passed, Sheriff Chad Bianco said during the press conference. Esther Gonzalez waited 45 years for us to identify her killer. Modern science finally made that possible. The Esther Gonzalez case represents both the promise and the limitations of modern forensic science. Advanced genetic genealogy made it possible to identify her killer after 45 years, but justice was limited because death had already claimed the perpetrator. Detective Delinsky continues to investigate other cases that might be connected to Lewis Williamson. Each DNA comparison takes months to complete, and many of the potential connections may never be proven conclusively. But the work continues because families like the Gonzalez's deserve answers, no matter how long those answers take to uncover. The case also highlights the importance of evidence preservation. The DNA samples collected in 1979 were carefully stored for decades, even though they seemed useless with contemporary technology. That preservation made it possible for genetic genealogy to finally identify Esther's killer 45 years later. Elizabeth Gonzalez has become an advocate for other families dealing with unsolved murders. She speaks at conferences and supports legislation that would improve funding for cold case investigations. Her sister's case has become a symbol of both the heartbreak and the hope that defines the world of cold case investigations. Esther can finally rest in peace, Elizabeth said in a recent interview. But there are so many other families still waiting for answers. We can't stop fighting for them just because we got lucky with science. The evidence that seemed worthless in 1979 became the key to justice in 2024. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs come not from new evidence, but from new ways of understanding evidence that has been waiting decades to tell its story. Lewis Randy Williamson took his secrets to the grave in 2014, but science found a way to make him confess from beyond death. For Esther Gonzalez and her family, that confession came 45 years too late, but it finally came. Subscribe, like, and comment if you're fascinated by how cutting-edge science is solving cases that seemed impossible to crack. Because every victim deserves justice, even if that justice takes nearly half a century to achieve.